If you've been following my channel, you know that recently I've done some videos on mini skirmish rules. I did two Frostgrave videos, and I talked about another fantasy skirmish video, Dragon Rampant, which is probably going to make an appearance at some point. In my investigation of skirmish rule sets, which I had never really thought seriously about for a long time, because first of all, I'm primarily a solo player, and second of all, I don't have minis. This would seem to suggest that I should stay away from mini rule sets. I came across Pulp Alley, and Pulp Alley has, as you can see here, an official solo deck that goes with it. This is called the Pulp Miniatures game, and it is a skirmish rule set, minis rule set that has a lot of board game elements to it, because even not the solo version involves a deck of cards called the Fortune deck. I don't have the Fortune deck here to show you, but it involves card play from your opponent and from you, in addition to moving the minis around on whatever terrain or environment you're playing. There's also a horror deck here that you're going to see, I will be discussing, that comes with this expansion. This is Tomb of the Serpent. It is a specific campaign environment, and these are also where the solo rules are contained. It has the, as it mentioned, solo rules, horror rules, and more, and it has specific setups for a campaign that you can play with chapters and things like that. So it is a little bit atypical, I think. Well, I'm far from a minis rule set expert, so I shouldn't say it's a little atypical. To me, in my investigation, it seems a little atypical in the relationship of the cards to the rules. These are some pre-made characters that come from Tomb of the Serpent, and we will just take a look at one of these cards here. This is designated a leader. You are playing in, you're creating leagues, is what they're called, that play against each other, and you can have leaders and followers and allies, and you can also have a sidekick. These are the generic character factions, I guess you'd call them, or character types really, that come into play, and they have different rules in terms of what types of dice they are rolling for various attributes they have, as well as how many specific skills each of them can have. So, for example, an ally can only have one additional skill, whereas a sidekick could have more than one. The dice that are involved in the game are d6, 8, 10, and 12, and you're going to need a bunch of them for each of the type of dice, because as you can see, for example, if this ally, this fierce cultist, was brawling, that would be hand-to-hand. He'd be rolling 3d6 as part of his roll, and in fact, this can be bolstered even beyond that. So this character, this sidekick, would be rolling 4d8, and even here, this leader, based on some additional attributes he has that gives him more dice for brawling, is going to be rolling 5d10 in brawling. And you'll notice here, his shooting, he has no ranged weapon, and that is because of this attribute. The animal attribute allowed him to add a d10 to his brawl roll, but it took away his ability to have any ranged type of capability. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we go through the rules. I'm not going to do a total rules overview, but I want to discuss it a little bit because it is a very easy to understand rule set and system. There are a few ambiguities I found in it, but overall, if you haven't played with mini rule sets very much, and I include myself in that category, I think this is probably a good place to start, especially for the soloist because of the solo rules. So let's take a look inside. This, the rules are, first of all, not terribly lengthy, and the back here are some scenario rules and also some rules for leveling up, as it were, or gaining more attributes as you go through different stories. So these aren't even the rules here, but you can, for example, get more gear through points that you earn in a scenario and take that gear with you into the next scenario that you play if you choose to play that way. Opening up, we see that there is a discussion here of Pulp Alley being the sort of essence of the pulse-pounding pace of your favorite pulps and serials. It is, I would say, genre neutral, despite the fact that I'm going to be showing you this deck that is horror based, and because of the material that I have, a little bit of a focus on that. You can use this in any type of setting. It's really the examples that they give, and I think it's really designed for, or the concept of the kind of 20s, 30s, 40s American pulp action movie and novels, and that you can see some of the mini pictures here. I think that's really what would be the best, and I do not, at least right now, have any minis that are of that ilk. All of the minis that I have are just from various fantasy games, and you could use this as fantasy. I don't want to demonstrate that because it's really not the heart of it, the feel of it is not designed that way, and I don't want to try to import it there. So that's why this is going to be mostly a discussion right now. To create a league, as mentioned, you have various major categories of types of players, and they will have a designation of how many dice and what nature of dice they are going to be rolling for their various skills and attributes, or it's called abilities, excuse me, how many abilities you are able to get. So the skills that you have a brawling ability for melee, shooting. Dodging has to do with combat and options you have. The combat mechanic is quite interesting, and I will discuss that in some detail, and dodging is involving a sort of defensive move to get out of the way. Might, finesse, and cunning. These come up largely through the cards, and I will talk about ways in which I think particularly the solo player could use these a little bit more than the rule set actually develops them. And so you choose your category. If you have one leader, it's given a health, and then you can select your skills that will start at 3 dice and how many skills start at 2 dice, and then you have your d10s and your d8s for that, and then you can choose, it says 3 abilities, and leaders can select from any level. If you flip a page later, you see the beginning of the abilities list, and we made reference to this animal ability here, which I showed you on the leader card. This character may not shoot, but adds 1d to 2 other skills. So that is an example of how that benefit would work. Some give you, for example, increasing your brawl by 1 die. And then as you move through the abilities list, it's clearly designated which type of character can choose from which type of list, and some of them allow you to move more, some allow you to have benefits when trying to escape what's known as a peril, and we'll get into talking about that. Some of them are more directed toward the opponent, so if you're hard-boiled, the enemy characters suffer a -1 dice penalty if they're trying to dodge your attack. This one in particular, I point out, it's a great ability, but when you're playing solo, generally speaking, the opposition does not use the dodge ever, so I wouldn't recommend taking that one, as I learned. But there are quite a few different ways to customize the character, and you can, for example, start somebody, if they're a master of disguise, they could start in hiding and do a sneak action, which we'll talk about a little bit. So there are ways in going through this to customize the characters, but generally speaking, the character creation is pretty easy to do once you just mark down how many skills get how many dice and then what the die number is. You can see that I've made up a little league here of characters and leaders, sidekick, allies, and followers, and just made a card like this. I didn't have, it would have been nice to have some blank cards like this if you wanted to write in, or maybe somebody wouldn't do that, I don't know. But, you know, this was sort of my chicken scratch to create my own characters. And you can see here, I chose that hard-boiled initially, and then I realized, no, that's not going to work. So I gave my leader some abilities that would be able to work as a soloist. So, for example, Deadeye allows me to override the rule that you need to shoot at the closest enemy. So I could shoot at whatever enemy I wanted to with my leader, and some other things. Combat in this game is interesting, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit here and just give some examples of how it works. These are both the leaders, and in this example, my leader initially is going to come into contact with this leader, this risen priest. And you can see here it says special horrific. This means that there is a potential for me to have a horror effect impact me from one of these cards if I cannot pass a horror check. The horror check that I need to pass is a roll based on my current health die, which in this case is a D10. Anything in this game that is a roll of 4 or better is a success. So in order for me not to be horrified at this risen priest, I need to initially roll, just upon contact, a D10 and see if I can roll a 4 or greater, and I rolled a 7, so I passed that horror check. Had I failed it, what I would have had to do is pull the top card from this horror deck, and we'll just do it anyway and see, and get this effect. So if I failed that, I would become on the edge, and it would say for the duration of this effect, this would be the impact, including I cannot shoot, so it means I'm just, I'm on my edge. I can dodge more, I have more finesse, but I'm kind of paralyzed at shooting and maybe planning something at a long distance. So this would become attached to my character. At the end of each turn, I would see if I could recover from that, and to recover from that, I would be rolling a d6, and again, on a 4, 5, or 6, I could lose the impact of this effect. If I failed that, it would continue on to the next turn until I was able to get rid of it. But that didn't apply here, so I did pass the horror check. So what is going to happen here, I've set this up so that we are going to do a melee, we're going to brawl with each other. For my character, I roll 3d10 in brawl, and the risen priest rolls 5d10 in brawl. And there are some additional effects here that have to do with damage to the priest if he gets any, but we will talk about that later. So let's do the roll and see what we get here. Well, I'll just leave it in the box here. All right, so here is a look at what is called matching dice. We can choose to match our dice against theirs at an equal or greater value, thus canceling out their hit as well as our own. So for example, in this particular case, we could do something like this. Get this a little clearer. We would cancel this and this out. Thereby, we would be inflicting 1 hit on them, and they would be inflicting no hits on us, but we would only inflict 1 hit. However, we could opt to not match these dice, for example, that way, and match it in a different way. If we matched it in a different way as such, they would have 2 hits going through, but we would have 3 hits going through. So this is a choice that you have in combat as to how risky you want to be in terms of matching up the dice, your successes against theirs, and what you want to cancel out. And that adds a bit of strategy and flavor to the game when you're playing. You know, I haven't played this opposed, so I don't know how that would impact the experience there, because when you're playing opposed, you have an option to try to use your dodge ability instead of matching say a brawl or a shooting ability to try to get out of the way. And if there are rules for being successful at getting out of the way, and then you move somewhere else or whatever. In solo play, you're directed to basically never have the opponent use the dodge ability. So you're always looking to resolve a fight and see, again, how many hits you can inflict versus how many wounds you take. Now, wounds are interesting as well. So in this case, we have, well, let's just say we took a wound. How does that happen? Or how does that get accounted for? So your health is represented by a current number of dice that you can roll for it. And in this case, we're at full health, we can roll a d10. What you do is for every wound that you get in combat, you need to roll your current health die and see if you get a 4, 5, or a 6. And if you do, you do not get that wound. If you do not, as in this case, you do get the wound. When you get the wound, you move down your health down to the new dice number, and this now represents your current health. The one thing that's important to note, and this is easily overlooked in the rules, I think, is that you cannot be rolling any dice for any of these attributes that is higher than your current level of health. So once this character is down to a d8, this means that when brawling or shooting, they can't roll 3d10s anymore. They have to go with 3d8s and 3d8s for shooting as well, actually for all of these, if their health is only at a d8. And there are some ways to recover your health. We talked about recovering from the horror attribute. There are some other ways to recover health, but that is how the health works. And you need to roll one of your health die for each wound that you potentially, or each wound that you get in a combat situation. And you can see, if you look at, for example, the followers here, they just start out with a d6. So you're going to lose these pretty quickly if they are wounded. And this is where this dodge value can come into play, because you may opt, rather than engaging in a combat, to try to dodge out of the way of the combat, thereby perhaps protecting yourself from getting wounds. Let's take a look at this deck of solo cards here. The rules for the solo are fairly simple, and what they require is that for the first 3 activations of a turn, a solo card is pulled and played on that character. This is true whether you choose the initiative for yourself, or you decide the opposition or the bot team is going to go first. And this is where it's not quite clear that it's always better for you to activate first or for them to activate first, because you don't know what's going to be on these cards, and generally speaking, they're not going to be great. So for example, this solo card says Surprise Twist. The effect is this side's activations end immediately. Switch to activating the opposing characters if able. Return to activating this side after all the opposing characters have activated. There is also a challenge that needs to be overcome, and it explains that you need to roll 1 success using your cunning value. So, for example, if the sidekick pulled this, they would roll 2 d6s, and they would need 1 to be higher than 4, or 4, 5, or 6. And if the challenge was not overcome, they would have 1 hit. That's a pretty serious challenge. So risking a card like this to allow your side to go first is tough. We'll look at some of the others. This one says Held in Place. This character cannot move. It's attached until the end of the turn, and the challenge here is to roll 2 successes with finesse or cunning, and your peril is 2 hits if you fail. And we'll just take a look at one more. The effect, you have to roll the challenge below. If you pass, you get a dice bonus, and if you fail, you cannot move during the activation. And here is the other challenge: 2 successes with your cunning or might. And that can be tough depending on your attributes, because you may have cunning. Well, for example, this follower only rolls 1d6 for cunning, so they're not going to be able to roll 2 successes with cunning, and ditto for their might. So they're sort of out of luck here and overmatched basically in that challenge. A few more points about combat. There are a few modifiers to take into consideration. So for shooting, for example, you get a 1 die bonus if you're within what's considered close range, which is within 6 inches. Long range, you get a detriment of a die, and that's over 24 inches. And if you have run, which is to say you have moved between 6 and 12 inches in that turn, you're going to be having a 1 die detriment for the rest of the turn. Additionally, there are some brawling modifiers, and these are listed here if you're in multiple combats. The notable one is this, that if the attacker has rushed over 3 inches, that means approached the base of the other model over 3 inches before reaching the target, the defender can choose to react with a shooting die rather than the brawl, and they would get the 1 die bonus for that close range. So that is something to consider in terms of if you're moving your model closely to somebody and running toward them to try a brawl, they could pull out a weapon and shoot you. That is another rule there kind of tucked away that is important to remember. And I'm not covering dodge so much because this doesn't really happen in solo play. And next, I want to move on to the narrative elements of this rule set, what I'm calling the narrative elements of the rule set. And those are the perils that come with the scenario, as well as what's called the plot points. And these are built into the scenario that you develop, and when a character encounters them, they are meant to have a plot point challenge, and we saw this earlier at the bottom of the solo cards that you would pull in. You would be dealing with one of these random challenges when you came to a plot point. In the main rule book here at the back, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but I want to turn to the elements here in the book on the scenarios. It explains to you how to set up a scenario and gives you a bunch of scenario background random tiles to roll on. And these are suggested plot points. So you could do it completely randomly. This is a D10 table, and they are suggesting that you take basically half of these, rolling the D10 5 times to get a general type of plot point, something to do with a facility or machinery or treasure. And then you go to the individual tables and roll twice on them to come up with what that might be. So for example, if you were having an encounter, you could encounter an injured agent. That would be one of the 5 plot points that you would get. And then once you had your 5 plot points, the suggestion is to go here and to pick what's known as a major plot point, one of them, and roll on these 2 tables and then come up with further information about that. Now, in theory, this is a great idea because it gives you a randomized framework for coming up with 5 different say desirable or necessary things to do or places to go on the terrain to accomplish something to get through the scenario. In practice, I have rolled up this 3 different times, and I have found it challenging because of the random nature of it to create a cohesive story. What happens is that there's a little bit too much randomness. So for example, looking at this treasure table here, this really gets into fantasy stuff. So for example, you could have a sacred orb or a cursed amulet. This is pretty standard fantasy stuff. On the other hand, when we look down to, say, this facility plot point, we have things that are very much more out of the traditional 20s, 30s pulp genre, like, a telephone box or a utility line. To reconcile these things into one story, I found challenging, especially when it was really the treasure one kind of stopped me up, but there were some other ones that seemed to be under, say, plot point invention, this semi-sci-fi kind of item, a sonic powder or a sonic laser or something. It was almost like it was too much of a mishmash of genres. It tried to do a little too much. So for my taste, I would try to not randomize the general options here, and maybe not even choose 5 different ones, but use this as a suggestion of something that would be cohesive to a story. So if you were going to be encountering, say, a foreign agent, just as an example, that suggests a certain type of genre. So a foreign agent might make sense with some type of facility plot point that had to do with, I don't know, telephone records or a supply terminal, but it wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the sacred tome. I mean, that just, to me, that's a little bit too much of a stretch. So that's a note of sort of hesitation that I have here, despite the fact that I enjoy and appreciate the concept behind this. Within the main rule book here, you do have a bunch of basic scenarios. There are ways to choose a one randomly, of course, and it will explain to you what the plot point markers, where they should be placed. And again, these are coming from that random table, or if you're following the rule book, they're coming from the random table, and give you any special rules that have to do with that scenario. What I just skipped over here, which comes oddly before those scenarios, are the capacities to level up or to gain things for your next adventure, which would include backup that you could essentially hire or have, contacts that you make that will possibly help you in the next adventure, and gear that you can, effectively purchase that will help you. And so these types of things enable somewhat of a campaign. Of course, you could decide to incorporate that just in the one time that you were playing, and there is actually a rule when setting up your league, I can't remember what it's called, but that will allow you to spend 1 point on the point levels are listed here, to spend 1 point to get 1 point of gear or contacts at the beginning of just the beginning of one scenario. So the campaign element is contained within here, and then of course the other booklet, which is the explicitly campaign-driven Tomb of the Serpent, is something that's an additional product that you could purchase that has different scenarios going through it that you could traverse by chapter, or you could just select randomly. And final point on recovery, I mentioned earlier there's a way to recover. You can roll a 1d6 at the end of each turn for each injured character, and a 4+ will let you regain 1 health die type, just so you can improve by 1. And if the character has already been knocked down at that point, it can be, if it fails that, it can be knocked out. There is a suggestion here, it says noteworthy, and this is indeed noteworthy, that when a character is KO'd, it doesn't have to mean they were killed. You can create, you can roll on the harrowing escape table. I haven't actually found that table, but maybe it's somewhere. But the point is that you can determine either by using that table or making your own what happened to the character if you don't want to lose them. So in true pulp form, you don't necessarily have to just lose a character and have them be dead. Maybe they get a miraculous recovery and come back in or whatever. And this is important because, as noted earlier, your followers are going to have very limited health here. They're really going to just have 1 hit that they can take before you lose them. So having some way of recovering a character is important and true to the theme of pulp. My intention was to demonstrate some gameplay in this video also, but I'm not going to do that because I have been playing this out using a combination of game boards and pieces from other games instead of minis, because I don't have the right minis for this. So for example, using these game boards with the buildings, I was able to more or less create this Nameless Ruin scenario from the Tomb of the Serpent, and using these chits from another game, I was able to assign the values of the leaders and the allies and the followers and play it out this way to get a sense of how the system worked, and it was actually pretty enjoyable. I also did it for a different scenario that I created using this map that's a more modern flavor, and there's a control room, and there are tunnels, and there's elevations here. I'm not going to show this because I'm not advocating that somebody play this way. This is a minis game, and it really does thematically cry out for the appropriate miniatures and terrain and things like that that I just don't have. And when I get that, or hopefully I'll be able to get that at some point, I will come back and do a demo of the actual play to see how it so that you can see how I play it out. But absent that, you can put this together using game pieces and either other minis if you had them, or in this case, since I didn't have anything even remotely appropriate outside of the fantasy genre that was a mini, just these pieces, and you could either do actual measurement or say that each hex is 1 inch and do the measurement that way, and obviously you would be creating the elevation situation for yourself. If you have a type of game board, that would work. But I'm not going to demo that here because, as I said, it really is meant to be played with more or less the appropriate minis, as you would expect. Overall, I think that the combination of the flexibility of the genres here, despite the fact that I found that a little too loose on the plot point creation table suggestions, but the flexibility of this overall allows for a lot of creativity, especially for the soloist, and the ease of the solo play by pulling in these cards to just have something, have an effect happen 3 times that is out of your control is helpful. Now, I will say what this leaves you with is a good portion of what you're doing as still having to play both sides, because if you, let's just say each league at the moment is 5 different characters. Even if you activate the other side first, it's only with the first 3 characters that you're having an impact of a card. And once you deal with that impact of the card, you still need to then act on the other side's behalf as if they would be acting. And the general rules are what you would expect. You know, they're coming at you as best they can, as ferociously as they can. So they're, you know, despite the generous selection of solo cards and impacts for the other side, there absolutely is still, the way the rules are written, an aspect of you have to play both sides. That's just, you know, it's just part of the nature of this type of rules. I mean, this is not a solo design game, nor should it be, but I think that, or I shouldn't say nor should it be, it's just, it's not what it is. But this is a great effort here to enable a little more solo play than just having to go back and forth. It might be worth considering, and I haven't spent enough time with this to know how to do it. I'm just going to show you a few more of these solo cards that you can look at while I'm talking. I haven't spent enough time with the rules to know how I might modify this, but I could envision modifying the official solo rules to somehow choose more cards during a round, or have a way of selecting cards for different sides. I'm not really sure. To just, it would impact this by having more randomness and things out of your control, but it might also enable you to have to do less management of the other side. I'm really not sure how that would work. So if you chose, say, 4 cards, or if you chose a card for, you know, the first 3 cards for the first 3 activations, and then, whoops, forced a card choice on the other side of 1 or 2 cards, how would that impact things? I'm not really sure, but that's something that I've been thinking of to just see how it would impact things. But overall, the rule set is clearly explained. It is easy to develop your characters, and the actions, I think, or attributes or whatever they're called for the different generic types of characters, the followers, the allies, and what is available, really do, the abilities, really do allow you to differentiate. If you spend time figuring out and making your characters thematic in terms of what they can do, you really can differentiate your character sufficiently so you have somebody that's really good at sneaking around and trying to dodge out of the way of things, and maybe they don't have as strong a brawl. You have somebody who has more of the fighter type, etc. There is enough variability here in these ability tables to make that possible without a lot of overhead and without having to spend hours creating an entire army of people. And that relatively quick and yet tailored setup for the characters that you're playing, I think, is a very strong point of this rule set, Pulp Alley, the Pulp Miniatures game.